Race for the Truth on Net Zero, challenging the government and NGOs on climate change, carbon tax efficacy, and net zero targets. Hi, I'm Michelle Sterling for Friends of Science Society. There's been a change in legislation via Bill C-59 on greenwashing in Canada, and it's caused a number of companies to scrub their websites of any material that they had posted about their efforts to meet net zero or to address climate change. This is far-reaching legislation with implications for every kind of industry and business in Canada. So I'd like to walk through some of the things I've found, and I'd also like to ask the question, who's really greenwashing who? So there's a dramatic change on greenwashing to Canada's Competition Act, slipped into Bill C-59. And this law firm, Norton Rose Fulbright, has done kind of a quick overview statement of some of the implications. I'll have a look at them with you. But first of all, what is greenwashing? This is from the Competition Bureau from January 23rd, 2017. And they're saying that before making environmental claims, businesses must make sure that the claims aren't misleading or likely to result in misinterpretation, are accurate and specific, are substantiated and verifiable, are relevant, and don't imply that the product is endorsed by a third-party organization when it isn't. So Bill C-59 creates jackpot injustice, catastrophic penalties, and it's wide open for lawfare. Let's look at what Norton Rose Fulbright had to say. It introduces new penalties of 10 million or 15 million for subsequent orders, or 3 times the value of the benefit derived from the agreement, or if that cannot be reasonably determined, 3% of worldwide gross revenues. And before this, the tribunal was limited to ordering behavioral remedy, telling people to take their ad down or to modify it in some way. It also introduces private applications for damages. So private parties can bring applications to the tribunal to challenge agreements or arrangements that they claim contravene Section 90.1. Previously, only the commissioner could do that. And there's a further section that private parties can also bring civil actions, and you can find that in the link to Norton Rose Fulbright. Particularly, this legislation targets things like net zero claims. So there's a new reverse onus provision that makes it reviewable conduct for the purpose of promoting directly or indirectly the supply or use of a product, or the purpose of promoting directly or indirectly any business interest by any means whatever, to make a representation to the public with respect to the benefits of a business or business activity for protecting or restoring the environment or mitigating the environmental and ecological causes or effects of climate change that is not based on adequate and proper substantiation in accordance with internationally recognized methodology, the proof of which lies on the person making the representation. Unfortunately, internationally recognized methodology standard is not defined and is unclear. So the mainstream journals and activists are thrilled by this legislation. Martin Olszynski has noted that the new greenwashing provisions apply to all sectors, but it appears to have rattled fossil fuel folks at Pathways Alliance and CAP. These are oil sands producers and oil and gas in Canada. This fellow is saying that Pathways Alliance Oil Sands Group removes all website social media content. This journal is saying the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers is cutting back the information shared on its website in response to Bill C-59. And Julie Siegel, who's with Environmental Defense, This is a slightly different topic, but it's related. Climate experts are clear: better to have no Canadian taxonomy than one which includes fossil fuels. It must align with the Paris Agreement, yet the government is considering including LNG. A fossil fuel taxonomy would muddy the waters rather than clarify them. And this comment in the Calgary Herald on June 7th was also from an environmental defense person telling the truth shouldn't be so hard. Well, I agree. So the new leader of the Alberta NDP, Naheed Nenshi, former mayor of Calgary, is saluting Shell Canada for their carbon capture project. But Rebecca Schultz, the Alberta Environment Minister, points out that unfortunately Trudeau's Bill C-59 is going to make it impossible for companies like Shell to talk about these achievements. So if we look at environmental defense, they claim that they're ending climate change, and that the problem is that without urgent action, Canada will experience climate change twice as fast as other parts of the world. They also claim that Canada has missed every climate target we've ever set, and that we're still approving new fossil fuel projects that will lock us into future greenhouse gas emissions. Well, we're also importing millions of immigrants and foreign students and foreign workers every year. And every person who comes here brings their own carbon footprint with them. They also expand their carbon footprint if they come from a warmer country. So if you come from Mexico or China, your carbon footprint personally is probably about 4 tons CO2 or 7, something like that. When you come to Canada, it's going to expand to 17. So as long as we have immigration at a very high rate, we're never going to be able to meet any climate target. And that is one reason why in the past we've never met them. It's funny that all these environmental groups have never thought about that. But let's see if that's the only problem. Oh, look at that. Northern Canada is warming at 3 times the global average, and so are all these other places. Canada's warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. Well, so then we already are warming. Is that correct? Look at this. Singapore's heating up too. Europe has been warming faster than the global average. Oh my gosh, West Antarctica is warming 3 times faster than the global average. Is this really about science or climate change? Obviously, it's not. And it's almost like these environmental, non-governmental group climate activists have never taken a science course, because you're not going to be ending climate change anywhere, anytime, because climate change is cyclical. And you can see that in the stripes ladders. Now, this has been going around on social media because it was Show Your Stripes Day on June 21st. And if you look at the short term, say the last 150 years or so, it does look kind of like we're in a really hot period, doesn't it? But if you go back in history, you find out that it's warm now. It was very cold in the Little Ice Age. It was hot in the medieval warm period, then cold, warm, cold, warm. You can see that it's cyclical. And if you go back even further into the Holocene interglacial warm period, and you follow this black line, you can see we're actually in a cooling period, and the recent nominal warming has been a good thing. And if you go back even further into the Cenozoic, you can see that when it was very hot, it was full of life, there was high CO2 concentration, 2,000 parts per million, and it's just been getting cooler all the time. So our president, Ron Davison, did that. You can see that on his personal website, Climate Change in Music, Stripe Charts Temperature. And this greenwashing legislation looks like trouble ahead for everyone. How many times have you been at a restaurant and had a napkin like this? Save the environment 1 napkin at a time. I think that's reviewable content now. Imagine. So it means if you go green now, which used to be a draw for consumers, because people thought, oh, look, they're so environmentally friendly, they're saving the planet. Now, It means you probably go broke. So, a reporter asked Prime Minister Trudeau, "Do you think the fact that the Pathways Alliance removed online content shows they would not have been in compliance with the new Bill C-59 greenwashing provisions?" And the Prime Minister goes on about freedom of expression, sharing points of view, foundation of free and open democracy. And he says that we must be basing our worldviews on things that are anchored in truth and reality. He continues to say, it's really important that organizations put facts out there. Take every care, be truthful and grounded in reality. And he also says that it's extremely important that journalists have the support and ability to challenge authorities, challenge all politicians in what they say. So let's do that, because it's the government and most environmental climate activist groups who are greenwashing you on climate change, carbon taxes, and net zero goals. Is the world rapidly transitioning to wind and solar? Is Canada a laggard? We'll have a look at the statistical review of world energy from the Energy Institute and see what the facts are. Here are the facts. Here's some points summarized by Robert Lyman, who's a retired energy economist and former federal public servant of 27 years, 10 years a diplomat. Here's the world energy use, 620 exajoules in 2023. Global GHG emissions rose in 2023 by 1.6%. In other words, they moved in precisely the opposite direction than that which the UN and all the alarmist groups are saying is absolutely essential to meet the net zero by 2050 goal. Emissions from developing nations rose. So the emissions by the non-OECD countries, that's the developing countries, rose from 66% of the global total to 68%. In other words, with every passing year, the measures taken by the OECD countries, that's the developing or the developed Western countries, to reduce emissions become ever less relevant to the global trends. China, the world leader in polluter who doesn't pay. China's emissions in 2023 accounted for 32% of the global total, compared to 13% for the USA, 10% for Europe, and 1.5% for Canada. China, growing emissions like never before. China's growth in emissions in 2023 far exceeded Canada's total emissions for the year. And the winner in the percentage rate of emissions growth, well, it's Vietnam, whose emissions grew by 18.6%. Oil, natural gas, and coal power the world. Production and consumption of coal, oil, and natural gas in 2023 all reached their highest levels ever. And hydrocarbons are still number one. The share of global primary energy demand met by hydrocarbons fell from 81.9% in 2022 to 81.4% in 2023. At this rate, the world will reach a zero hydrocarbon share of global energy demand by the year 2184, although one should not bet on that. So there's just no transition and just no net zero. Hydrocarbons still provide over 80% of the energy used to generate electricity globally. Renewables, including wind, solar, and biomass, account for only 9%, and wind and solar combined account for only 4%. And a fun fact, wind and solar create regional warming, the thing they're supposed to stop. And how about carbon taxes? Despite international carbon tax regimes, there's no drop in emissions. And prices for carbon taxes range from 1 cent per ton CO2e to $154 per ton. That's Uruguay. So the range of explicit carbon prices is very wide, As of August the 1st, 2023, they range from 1 cent per ton in Baja California in Mexico to $154 in Uruguay. Currently, over 70% of the covered GHG emissions are still priced at less than $20 US per ton CO2e. However, in 2017, the Stern-Stiglitz report estimated that the incitative effect of these mechanisms could only be fully achieved with prices ranging from $40 to $80 US per ton CO2e in 2020 and from $50 to $100 US dollars per ton CO2e in 2030. And where is all that carbon money going? All those carbon taxes, where do they go? Well, 32% goes to general budget. And this says that after reaching 97 billion US dollar value in 2021, carbon pricing revenues have stabilized at 93 billion in 2022. This decrease is mainly due to exchange rate movements, and more than 50% of carbon revenues are earmarked for green or development projects, while 10% are redistributed to households or companies affected by carbon pricing, while the remaining 32% goes into the general budget of each jurisdictions without specific allocation. So the carbon taxes in Canada and France are 9% and 7% respectively, whereas the European, British, and German ETS trading schemes are 44%, 8%, and 7% respectively. Canada has also become a carbon tax promoter to the world. Franco Terrazzano of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation posted this today on Twitter, on X. Trudeau is spending $1.7 million in a failed attempt to get other countries to impose carbon taxes. You pay the carbon tax, you pay more for bureaucrats to tax you, and you're also paying for Trudeau to push this tax on other countries. Facts matter. Numbers don't lie. Global energy use in 2023 hit a new record, 620 exajoules, of which about 81.5% came from hydrocarbons. And what energy transition? Here are the CO2 emissions in 6 largest economies from 2000 to 2023. This is by Robert Bryce, and he's also referring to the Energy Institute's statistical review. So we have Japan, UK, Germany, the US, India, China. What energy transition? And the change in CO2 emissions in the 6 largest economies from 2000 to 2023. Well, Japan is down, UK is down, Germany down, US down. India has grown dramatically, and China, look at that, 7,890 million tons. So why have these declined? Well, these ones here have mostly offloaded their industrial economies to India and China. So there's no real reduction in CO2. It's just a degrowth and job loss in these nations. So telling the truth shouldn't be so hard, Mr. Trudeau. He says that we need to make sure that people are debating and discussing and basing their worldview on things that are anchored in truth and reality. So I've just shown you the energy reality of the world. And about getting to net zero, well, it's just not going to happen. Now, this is from a report that we analyzed, and we have it on our blog called Getting to Net Zero. And it shows that there's actually no way we can get to net zero unless we engage in degrowth and poverty for all. Or, of course, we can just pretend. We could do carbon cap and trade. We could use the voluntary carbon market. So cap and trade is how you would buy and sell carbon credits between companies that are over their cap, trading with companies that are under their cap. So they're selling surplus credits to the large emitters. And this has to be the best description of this market ever. The carbon market is based on the lack of delivery of an invisible substance to no one. And I must say that one of our Twitter followers came up with the greatest line ever as well. And that was that carbon trading is like having a burglar try to rob your house and you just pay them money to go and rob your neighbor. So it would be greenwashing to be cap and trade, wouldn't it? It's like what the government is doing to you on carbon tax and net zero climate targets. Because the ugly truth on net zero is this. There's no material supply chain that exists for net zero 2030 or 2050. It takes about 16 years to get a mine operational. This chart is from the work of Professor Simon Michaud, and he assessed the quantity of metal required to make just one generation of renewable tech units to replace fossil fuels, and he found that it's much larger than first thought. So he looked at the global metal production in 2019, and then he just extrapolated it out to produce one generation of technology units to phase out fossil fuels using these specific metals that are required for high-tech and the net zero generation. And he found that the years to produce these metals at the 2019 rates of production would be 189 years for copper, 400 years for nickel, 9,920 years for lithium, 1,733 years for cobalt, etc., etc., etc. Not only do we have a problem with the material supply chain, we have a problem with prices. Because everyone's trying to get to net zero, of course, the prices of these commodities are skyrocketing, and copper hit $10,000 per ton market price in April 2024. So why are we still acting like net zero is economically feasible? People keep telling us that net zero will lower consumer prices. It doesn't seem that that's likely at all. And of course, China holds all the cards. So if we look at the geographical concentration of current and announced manufacturing capacity for solar PV, China is marked in red here. You can see China is dominant for wind, China is dominant for batteries, China is dominant for electrolyzers. It's certainly got at least half the market share. And for heat pumps, well, okay, so some other countries in the world can make heat pumps. And Alberta, aren't you glad the NDP phased out coal to save the planet? Because now it can be used by all these other people in the Asia-Pacific area of the world. And how about the EV policy? Do we have enough power generation to support it? Now, this was done by Kent Zare, professional engineer, and it was done in 2019 before the more stringent EV targets. And in his view, at perfect efficiency, it would be impossible to meet the targets because we require more than 10,000 megawatts of additional electrical generation capacity are required for Canada to be 100% electric passenger vehicles by 2040. So at the present time, that was then, there were 2 large power projects being built in Canada, Site C in BC, and Muskrat Falls in Newfoundland and Labrador. Combined, they have a capacity of 1,924 megawatts, which is, pretty much shy of this if they meet their design capacity. So building these kinds of projects like Site C has been in development and construction for 30 years easily. It's $16 billion now, so way over budget. And Muskrat Falls is also way over budget and has had some other technical issues. Both have had technical issues. And so This would require us to build 8 additional Muskrat Falls in the next 6 to 26 years. Each of these projects take probably 20 years to build. So, because you have to select the site, design the project, get all the environmental approvals, do all the geological surveys, order all the materials, create all the logistics to bring everything to the site. There are many environmental concerns now, of course, and under UNDRIP, many First Nation concerns. So it won't be easy to build a dam in Canada or anywhere in the Western world. And also, a lot of the best sites have already been taken. So just coming up with 8, 10 more sites to build a dam, that would be very difficult. Not to mention, we're only talking here about the EV supply of power generation. The net zero plan requires that all houses would be electrified, all commercial buildings would be electrified instead of using natural gas for heating, that most industries would be electrified, like for steel making, that some electrical process would be used instead of burning coal. So think of the many, 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 many more power generation units we would need, not to mention many of these things, I understand, like transformers and such, like these are the big, huge substations. They take 5 years or more to order, and most of them are also made in China. So, it's going to take a long time and cost a lot of money. We'll be ordering them from a competitor, and doesn't look very possible, does it? So that doesn't sound like we're dealing with reality, which is what the Prime Minister said we should be dealing with. And the Fraser Institute did a similar analysis. They found that the volume and time required to develop new mines to make EV mandates near impossible to achieve. So they said there would need to be 388 new mines needed by 2030, and they laid out the time to start a new nickel mine, 13 to 18 years, lithium, 6 to 9 years. So, it doesn't, if this is the deadline that all new vehicles are EVs, it doesn't look possible, doesn't look like reality. So it seems like when it comes to due diligence, nobody in government has done any due diligence on this, and none of the NGOs have done it either. So the truth on net zero, it's unattainable with current technology. There's no viable material supply chain. No one in government did the necessary due diligence, and the ENGOs are greenwashing you on climate action too. The truth is that every Canadian is paying the price for the federal government's lack of due diligence on net zero policies and the cost of climate regulations. The price is too high, and the benefits immeasurable. So these are 3 reports that Robert Lyman did. One is, what are climate policies costing Canada? In short, it equates to roughly $28,000 per household, an average of $2,800 per household per year. And there's a program for contracts for difference, which he calls turning taxpayers into risk takers. So taxpayers are actually underwriting businesses. And this is one example in which he says that the price of 86.50 or $86.50 per ton, plus an additional payment of $200 million, the federal expenditure totals $978.5 million, or almost $1,000 a ton, which is an absurdly high cost. And the third one, burdensome ideology, the cost to Canada of climate regulation. So he's talking about the overall net zero transition. The published estimates range between $2 trillion and $5.2 trillion, which is almost an unimaginable amount of money. So 2 trillion is $50,000 for every one of Canada's 40 million residents, or 118,000 for every household. 5.2 trillion is 130,000 for every resident, or 306,000 for every household. So averaged over 27 years, going to net zero 2050, 2 trillion would cost every one of today's residents about $1,850 per year. Averaged over 27 years, 5.2 trillion would cost every one of today's residents $4,815 per year. And these are all added together. These are all happening at the same time. So Bill C-59, welcome to Canada's eco-dictatorship, where climate compliance requires censorship and silence, while foreign-funded NGOs and government policymakers freely mislead you on net zero and climate change. And as for ending climate change, well, this is a quote from Dr. Judith Curry, who's an actual climate scientist. And she says that thinking that catastrophes like major hurricane landfalls, massive forest fires, etc., will be cured by eliminating fossil fuel emissions is laughable. Well, it's not really funny. Thinking that eliminating fossil fuel emissions will solve the problem of extreme weather events is very sad, sort of on the level of doing rain dances. Everything that goes wrong, they blame on fossil fuel-driven climate change. Imagine how surprised they would be if we were to ever be successful at eliminating fossil fuel emissions, and then we still had bad weather. Dr. Curry also wrote, back in 2014, that carbon dioxide is not a control knob that can fine-tune climate. So, referencing an internationally recognized methodology, the fact is that climate change cannot be stopped, not by climate activists, not by shutting down fossil fuel companies, and not by taxing people into oblivion. The following calculations are based on IPCC data, that's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because it's relied upon by the Canadian government. However, this should not be interpreted as an explicit or implicit endorsement of the validity of IPCC reported science. So from this section of the Climate Change 2023 Synthesis Report, they say for every 1,000 gigatons CO2 emitted by human activity, global surface temperature rises by 0.45 degrees Celsius. This means that each megaton of man-made emissions causes 0.0000045 degrees Celsius global temperature increase. Canada's total emissions in 2022 were 548 megatons. Therefore, the impact on global temperature of Canada going to net zero is this. I'm not going to read all this math to you, but it's 1 degree Celsius per 4,055 years. Come on, boil. The IPCC, with its internationally recognized methodology, shows that you can't stop or predict climate change. They say, in climate research and modeling, we should recognize that we are dealing with a coupled, nonlinear, chaotic system, and therefore that long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible. Politicians can't stop climate change. So we've been fighting for freedom from climate tyranny for 21 years, and we were the test case in 2015. If you recall, EcoJustice filed a complaint with the Competition Bureau against us for our billboards. Now, you can see that these kind of greenwashing legislation, this could have a very detrimental effect on all kinds of industries in Canada. Imagine if you're an ad agency, for instance, which is a fairly big market in Canada. If you're a magazine publisher, if you have online advertising from any corporation or any business, imagine what you can't say now. And in fact, the risk of saying something and then being caught out by some aggrieved, you hurt my feelings individual is so high now that, the lawfare could simply preclude anyone from advertising anything. That would shut down all the ad agencies. It would take away a huge chunk of income from all media outlets that sell advertising, and put all kinds of creative people on the street. And what are they going to do? Are they going to become climate activists in order to make their daily bread? Or is this part of the method to institute universal basic income? Because it appears like the government's busy trying to put pretty much everybody out of work. That's the only conclusion that I can come to. Now, as I've shown you, net zero is not attainable with current technology. Like, let's say we had small modular reactors. Okay, that's a possibility. But it will take probably 20 years for those to actually infiltrate into the market and for the necessary infrastructure to be built for it. So, many of these so-called solutions are not actually market ready yet. So net zero is not attainable. There's no material supply chain for the net zero climate solutions, as I've shown you. There's no time frame to meet those net zero commitments without the material supply chain as well. Because of the mining restrictions, you just need that much time to set up a mine, because mines are typically out in the middle of nowhere, so you can't get all of your equipment in unless you build the infrastructure in, right? So all of these things simply take time. It's just a fact of life. So these climate activists and the federal government are actually greenwashing the citizens, and they've instituted a law to stop greenwashing. So I'll leave you with that, and I ask you to please subscribe to our channel. Please share our material. We've got lots of stuff on our website, and we'd love to have you as a member. You can join us on our website. You can donate to us. We've been fighting this fight as a small volunteer-run group for the past 21 years. We're in our 22nd year of operation now, and we don't take money from government. We're not an industry proxy. We're just a group of concerned citizens, engineers, geologists, and atmospheric scientists and solar scientists who don't want to see our way of life compromised by ideology that's not based on reality. So we advocate for open civil debate on climate and energy policies and full cost-benefit analysis before the implementation of these climate policies. That used to just be known as good public policy, and now it's, just been forgotten, thrown aside. So I thank you very much for watching this presentation. Please help us, please support us, please share our material. For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Sterling.